It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Joel Busher. Joel has got a lengthy biography, which you are welcome to read at your leisure, but I want to say how important Joel's work has been to many of us in this field. Joel's work in particular on far-right extremism, everything stretching from what the internal breaks are within far-right groups about what stops them in terms of group dynamics from mobilizing to violence, all the way through to some of the challenges and how to address them that face researchers who are working on far-right extremism. It's had a massive impact in the field, and it's been really important to many of us who work with Joel and who cite and learn from his work regularly. So Joel is going to be speaking to us today about how relevant is preventing and countering violent extremism in today's changing threat landscape. I think we had a lot of really exciting perspectives offered yesterday on how that threat landscape is actually shifting and where that leaves us. And I can't wait to hear what Joel has to say about this. So Joel, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks to Lydia, Nell, Ben, and everyone who's contributed to organising this event. Thank you to you all. It's a real privilege to be here and to have the opportunity to to spend yesterday learning from yourselves, have the opportunity to share some of my sort of thoughts and experiences now, and then a chance to carry on the discussions over the next 2 days. So thank you very much indeed. So as Michelle said, I'm going to talk about how relevant PCV is in today's changing threat landscape. I'm not going to bombard you with PowerPoints. So I'm just going to talk through really a few of the main points I want to reflect on around this topic. So I'm going to make three main arguments. The first of those arguments, and actually I think these pick up quite a lot on what we were discussing yesterday. The first of those arguments is that in most Western democracies now, the non-state act of political violence that we should be most worried about is that involving far-right actors. And this is also the case in some non-Western democracies, and thanks to some of the contributors yesterday for bringing that into focus. I do think that the threats we're facing now are a bigger threat than those posed by Al-Qaeda, IS-inspired actors, even than they were at their height. You know, thinking back to that period of sort of 2013, 14, 15. So actually, I think that this is a greater threat than we've experienced back then. And I'll explain a bit about what I mean by that. The second argument I want to make is that what we currently know as PCVE is unlikely to be able to address those threats. The argument I then want to make, however, is that PCVE can still contribute something important, and the important thing is for us to capture that and keep hold of that. I'm going to base these comments on my own research over the last sort of 15 years or so. As Michelle said, quite a lot of that was focused on looking at far-right movements, anti-minority movements. So that includes some quite extensive ethnographic fieldwork with anti-Muslim protest movements, interview-based research with far-right and anti-minority activists. Also research looking at the enactment of PCVE in practice. So working with Michelle's collaborator, Paul Thomas, looking at how PCVE is actually put into practice on the ground in different settings. Also evaluation work of PCVE programs. I've had the opportunity to work with practitioners across the UK who are doing PCVE work and trying to evaluate those programs and looking at how we actually insert evaluation into those programs in a way that enables us to sort of garner insight about how these programs are actually working or sometimes not, as the case may be. I am going to make particular reference to a number of the chapters from the Routledge Handbook on Radicalisation and Countering Radicalisation that will be available in all good bookshops by Christmas, and to which Michelle has also contributed. I'm also going to pick up a little bit more sort of broadly on my experience of working in this field. I started working in the area of PCV back in 2009 as a civil servant. I was part of a team that was commissioned to look at the underlying evidence base for the frameworks that were underpinning the UK's prevent strategy at the time. And I've never managed to escape the field since then, and here I still am. I'm going to talk mainly about Western democracies, and I'm going to talk mainly, I suppose, through that experience has largely been based in the UK and Northern Europe. I do want to note, however, that this is a policy agenda that goes well beyond Western democracies these days. Earlier this year, I was in Brussels with colleagues from the G5 Sahel, from Kenya, looking at how PCV is being integrated into a range of other policy agendas in different parts of Africa and different parts of the Middle East as well. And it's, we're very well aware this is a global phenomenon. I currently supervise students, Indonesian students, for example, who are looking at PCV programs in Indonesia. So anyway, on with the first point that I want to make. So in most Western democracies, the non-state actor political violence that we should be most worried about is that involving far-right movements. Picking up on some of the themes from yesterday, it's probably helpful to say what I mean by far-right movements. I'm going to use this in a fairly loose sense at this point in time. So I'm thinking about movements that are informed by some form of racial or ethno-nationalism, that have tendencies towards authoritarian positions, so rejection of at least some parts of the institutional architecture of representative democracy. So things like independent judiciary, respect for international law, and so forth. And also movements that reject the basic principles of equal rights and protections of citizens regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, religion. So that's broadly what I'm talking about. Is the far right a form of extremism? Again, thinking about some of the provocations yesterday, the commitment to racial or ethno-nationalism is likely to entail some kind of commitment to the domination of some groups by other groups. And so on J.M. Berger's definition, this is, if not a form of extremism, it's something proximate to some form of extremism. I think there's an interesting debate about how necessary actually, or how useful that is, but I think it's something proximate, let's say, to what J.M. Berger was talking about yesterday. It's important to acknowledge, and this is some of the presentations yesterday, and some of the presentations about the data of people who are being picked up in the system yesterday were fascinating. The characteristic of the current far-right movement is very complex, and it's often difficult to decipher some of the intersections between, if you like, more sort of conventional, traditional far-right movements and other anti-establishment movements. This has certainly been one of the things that has been at the heart of the work that I started doing in this area back in sort of 2009, 2010, when I started doing ethnographic fieldwork with a group called the English Defence League, and the way that people sort of negotiated the boundaries between ethno-nationalism, anti-Muslim sentiment, broader kind of anti-migrant positions. And so I think it's important to recognise there's this kind of, I think someone used the term yesterday, the sort of grab bag of different grievances and concerns that are coming together. And I think that's more the case now. I was mentioning to a couple of people yesterday, no reason why you would have seen this, but last week in Ireland, not a country that has a sort of a long history of sort of overt far-right activism. In Ireland last week, they had a protest where, surprise, surprise, what did we see? We saw sort of a mixture of anti-COVID, anti-migrant, local green policies, mixed together with some people from sort of more sort of classical ethno-nationalist movements, erecting a gallows outside the Parliament. I mean, there's this sort of interesting combination that we're seeing. That's really important, I think, in terms of trying to understand the types of threats that are being posed by the far right today. So I'm going to provide a bit of an explanation now as to why I think this is such an important threat. I'm going to base this on some work that I've carried out with a number of colleagues over the last 3 or 4 years. So Julia Ebner at ISD and Oxford University, Gareth Harris, a colleague of mine, and Sophie Haksek and Graham Macklin from the Centre for Research on Extremism in Oslo. In this piece of work, it was commissioned by Crest in the UK, and they asked us to look at waves of far-right activism. So we were trying to look at pathways towards and away from violence during these waves of far-right activism. So we looked at 4 waves of far-right activism that were centred around particular locales. So we looked at one case study that took place in the southeast of England, a place called Dover, another one that took place in the northeast of England, Sunderland, a series of protests that some of you might be familiar with that took place in Chemnitz, in Germany, and then the events that I'm sure you're all familiar with that took the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And what we're trying to do was to trace, I say, these pathways towards and away from violence. One of the things with all of those waves of violence that we saw was that all of them had the potential to be more violent than they were. Now, that seems like a strange thing to say sometimes, because we tend to think of this as being something that's sort of inherently violent. You know, even the events that we saw in Charlottesville, and we know that there was, you know, Heather Heyer was murdered there, but actually the potential for violence was so much greater than what we actually saw. So this is one of the things that we were interested in, was why don't we, you know, why isn't there more lethal violence involving these kind of waves of protest? When I'm not going to go into the whole project. Basically, we combined sort of social media data with interview data, with lots of observational data. There's so much video footage, and we were doing lots of sort of analysis of the microdynamics of these protest events. One of the things that came out of it that we didn't expect, we didn't go looking for. So what we're trying to do is to find sort of the mechanisms that help us to understand the pathways towards and away from violence. And our findings kind of gave us a problem, because we had contradictory findings. So we had kind of like contradictory mechanisms. And it took us a while to work out what was going on. But what we think was going on is that actually there were different pathways towards violence. And what we started to do is to talk about these as a movement marginalized pathway and a movement emboldened pathway. So the movement marginalized pathway is essentially what we see. The best example of that is our Dover case study. So there's an absence of ties into political elites. There's an absence of ties, really, or interest almost in building wider public support. So there's not much of a focus within those far-right actors involved in Dover on sort of trying on the optics. You know, they're not too worried about what the wider public think of what they're doing. The moderates in the movement step away. You know, they say this is not going in a direction that we feel comfortable with. And what you start to see is this competition for dominance within that movement is really all around, like, who's the most radical, who's the toughest, and this kind of, you know, opens the gate to violence. You know, violence emerges out of that kind of dynamic. The movement emboldened pathway is quite different. In the movement emboldened pathway, and this is best epitomised by what we saw in the Chemnitz case study, but also to some degree what we saw in the Charlottesville case study, is that violence happens because the actors involved start to think that essentially members of the political and cultural elites have their backs. They start to think that the bits of the public that they're interested in, that they care about, are sympathetic to what they do, even if they use violence. And they test the parameters, and they push the parameter, and they get a bit more, and they don't see the support go away. So they push it another level. And as they do that, that expands the range of, if you like, appropriate violence. Most movements operate according to some kind of theory of appropriate violence. So they expand their parameters of appropriate violence, and this is where we see the violence coming from. So these are two quite different pathways. We think that the emboldened pathway is far more concerning in terms of, from a national security perspective. That's not to say that we shouldn't be worried about the marginalised pathway. Obviously, it's distressing. It's worrying, particularly for the people who might be targeted through the violence that comes through that marginalised pathway. But it's not as concerning, I think, when we're talking about things like national security, or when we're talking about things like, our wider social fabric. Why do we think it's more concerning? There's fewer intervention points. It's much harder to intervene and that's in part because in that movement emboldened pathway, what you see is the actors involved in the far right in those kinds of pathways have influential allies. There's less space for practitioners to operate. At the moment, later this month, later next month, I'm going to Chemnitz, and one of the issues in Chemnitz, as they're preparing to be the European Capital of Culture, is the political space to operate involves people who are sympathetic to the people who are involved in violence. So that creates a very hard space for policymakers and practitioners to operate. There's also, in the movement emboldened pathway, there's more reason, more motivation for actors within those movements to persist even in the face of setbacks, because they think that they've got that sort of wider network of support to tap into. So they're more likely to continue sort of pursuing violence, even as they might experience setbacks. And of course, the other reason why it's more concern is about the wider ripple effects, the wider effects that it has on society, on politics. So the way that violence that emerges out of the movement emboldened pathway fosters forms of taking sides, boundary hardening, justification of violence. In the worst case scenario, democracy unravels. And we've had in recent years, scholars of civil wars, people like Barbara Walter, talking about how actually this can produce a slide potentially towards civil conflict. I think the alarming thing is that when we look at what types of pathways we're seeing across a number of Western democracies, most obviously probably in the US, but also Germany, arguably the UK, parts of Eastern Europe, is we're increasingly seeing that movement emboldened pathway being the pathway rather than the movement marginalised pathway. And that is a source of concern. And I think this is where those sort of grab bags that we were talking about yesterday are important, because what we're talking about is far-right movements that actually, through these kind of complex convergences of grievances, are having an extraordinary reach into different milieus. So they're building support among people, among communities who, 10, 15, 20 years ago wouldn't have been, they wouldn't have been connecting with those people. I think that is why this is such a source of such concern. Again, picking up on something that came up yesterday, we don't see those similar movement emboldened pathways, those similar movement emboldened dynamics in other radical milieus. So I'm not making an argument here that the far right is inherently or sort of, a priori more dangerous, that it necessarily is always going to do more violence than other milieus. History doesn't really sort of bear that out. I think there's some good arguments as to why there are particular tendencies towards violence within far right movements. And I think that is around the way that ideas about the dominance of one group over another group leads to boundary hardening. We know that one of the main drivers of conflict is boundary hardening. So I think there are things inherent within far right ideology that make conflict, make violence more likely. But the point that I'm really wanting to make about the far right at the moment is not so much about that, but actually about the relational dynamics of political violence. Yesterday we had Donatella Della Porta talking with us, and one of the key insights from her work sort of back in the 1990s was about the relational nature of violence. So violence emerges out of a particular kind of relational constellation, a set of relationships that make violence more likely. It emerges out through action between these involving these different actors. Non-state actor political violence is more likely to emerge and is more likely to be transformative when it puts pressure on existing social cleavages. So that's very clear from the literature on civil wars, so where people talk about this sort of stacked identities, when we talk about factionalization. So more factionalized countries are more likely to slide into civil wars. Non-state actor political violence is also more likely to be transformative when there is at least tacit or explicit elite support for violence. And again, pick your historical example, whether it's the Nazis in Germany, whether it's Falangists in Spain, whether it's the very extended period of violence meted out in the US through the Klan, whether it's pick your genocide. There's always some form of elite support involved. And so I think this is why these kinds of relational dynamics, where we're seeing that there is support within some members of political and cultural elites, that's why this is dangerous. This is different to what we see, certainly in most Western democracies. This is different to what we see at the moment, whether we're talking about Al-Qaeda, IS-inspired violence, whether we're talking about contemporary left-wing movements, Black Lives Matter, environmental activism. We don't see, with all of those movements, there is an absence of elite support. They don't have people within political and cultural elites who sort of have their backs or who sympathize. Critically, when we do see escalation of violence with any of those types of movements, the people who might even be in some way sympathetic push back on that violence. So we've seen that, if we're looking at thinking about sort of left-wing groups, for example, whenever there's any escalation of violence, we saw a couple of years ago, there was some more significant violence that came out of Antifa. We saw very quickly, even within Antifa in the US, a pushback on that violence. We saw within sort of the wider sort of left-wing milieus, within anti-racist movements, pushback on that violence. So containing that violence, it's not encouraged, it doesn't then sort of build. So these are sort of, if you like, sort of semi-internal breaks. So this is one of the reasons why I think we have to be really careful with the equivalences. I know it feels quite comfortable, quite easy sometimes to say, well, we have to be looking across all forms of what we might call extremism. But I think we have to be mindful of how these relational configurations are different when we look across these different movements. So even if the acts that we're looking at might be ostensibly similar, they're embedded within very different sets of relationships. Okay, so moving on to point number 2. So what we currently know is PCVE is unlikely to be able to address these threats. So I think it's really important to acknowledge, to recognise that PCVE has actually come a long way. I think it's been a very influential sort of idea globally over the last sort of 15 years or so. Often quite maligned, sometimes with good reason. But I think if you look at the research on PCVE and around sort of PCVE, and if we look at the practice, I think it has come a long way. And I'm just going to touch on some of those developments for a few minutes. Our understanding of violent extremism and radicalization pathways is still far from perfect, but it has improved enormously since people talking about conveyor belts and staircases back in the early 2000s. So we've moved past those kinds of linear models. We now have far more multifaceted, sort of dynamic models. So work with people like Noemi Bahana, work by people like sort of Matteo and Greg on their 3 Ps. We have sort of more complex understandings of how radicalization actually happens. We have a far more complex understanding now of the role of ideology. In our handbook, there's an excellent chapter by Kumar Ramakrishna on this, moving away from this idea of ideologies as some sort of doctrine to a more sort of complex understanding of how ideology can work as a map and how ideology is actually sort of in constant dialogue with action. So a far more sort of dynamic understanding. Same with identity. You know, the work of people like Julia Ebner, Harvey Whitehouse on identity fusion, and bringing together a person with group identities and how that happens, again, through practice, through their interactions with other actors. You know, that's miles ahead of where we were 15 years ago. We understand radicalization these days, not only as a process, but as a multi-final process. Wow, I mean, you know, like 15 years ago, if people talk of radicalization, it meant, you know, you're on your way to terrorism. Whereas these days, there's a recognition and understanding that actually radicalization can take you in all sorts of different directions. Some of those directions don't actually involve violence at all. You know, at the moment, there's work by people like Bart Sherman and Sarah Carthy that's been, you know, really important in providing a robust evidence base around that. And some of my work on internal breaks sort of sits there looking at how even sort of collective processes of radicalization don't always lead toward violence, and sometimes they lead towards quite specified, constrained forms of violence. Our understanding of the collective processes has improved enormously, drawing largely from insights from, you know, work on social movements, contentious politics, work on conflict more broadly. So our understanding of those processes is a lot better. Risk assessment tools. Okay, so there are still flaws in the risk assessment tools that we have, but there's a far more mature conversation now than there was, you know, even 10 years ago. So moving away from simple correlations to the kind of stuff that Caitlin was talking about yesterday. So interactions and effects, including the role of protective factors and how protective factors interact with risk factors. So again, work with people like Paul Gill, Emily Corner, Bettina Rottweiler, really sort of transforming our understanding there. We've got a much better understanding of what can help build resilience to violent extremism. And again, you know, some of the presentations that we had yesterday helped to illustrate that. And also of how PCVE can go wrong. I mean, this has been something that's been quite extensively documented now. There's a lot that we can learn from sort of the research onto the mistakes that have happened with PCVE, the unintended consequences. We've got a much better understanding of how to improve the information flows that are necessary for sort of effective PCVE to happen, whether that is in terms of effective multi-agency working. So within the handbook, again, there's an excellent chapter by Robin Anderson Malmros and Jenny Sillenbring that talks about how multi-agency work on PCV has advanced, really, and also sort of how different actors interact with one another in different settings and what the conditions are that are required for that to be effective. But also information flows in terms of community reporting. Some of the work that Michelle and Paul Thomas have done has, again, been taken us so far beyond that where our understandings were before. We've got a much better understanding now about how other public services can contribute to PCVE efforts, whether that's in terms of education, healthcare, social care. Again, so work by people like Stein Siekerlink have really helped there. And we all know that we need more evaluation, better evaluation, and especially more published evaluations of PCV programs. But again, you know, as part of the process of pulling together that handbook, I co-authored a chapter about evaluation with my colleague Tom Fisher, a long-term PCV evaluator. And you know, there's a lot of good evaluations out there now, but not as many as we want. But actually, in terms of addressing some of the technical challenges that we initially had with evaluating PCV programs, we've kind of addressed a lot of those. Actually, you know, we've learned from other fields. So the actual quality of some of the evaluations, particularly the ones that are kind of, let me say, the ones that are embracing some of the more innovative designs. But there are now some really good evaluations. And actually, we're seeing the emergence of a real kind of evaluation culture, I think, within PCV that, again, you know, just wasn't there 10, 15, not even that long ago. Like shortly before the pandemic, you know, we still didn't have it. Whereas I mean, in the UK now, there's almost an expectation that if you're doing a PCV program, there's going to be at least some form of evaluation. And that's not just process evaluation, it should also be on impact. So the field has evolved. And I think that's really important to remember. But even so, it's unlikely to be able to address the challenges that I was describing. So why is that? I think part of that is about the social and political cleavages that the type of far-right activism I was talking about leans upon. So in the US, UK, Germany, we've already seen how attempts to refocus PCV efforts to increasingly be focused on far-right threats have been sucked into the politics of the culture wars. The issue, I realise this is being filmed, but we had this so-called independent review in the UK, which is a huge missed opportunity. So people, both sort of supporters and critics of Prevent, had for a number of years been calling for there to be an independent review. There's an opportunity here to, I suppose, set to one side a lot of the often sort of quite fractious debates around this policy agenda and build consensus. But unfortunately, that process was really undermined by what was a nakedly political appointment. The appointment of somebody who didn't have credibility among the critics of Prevent, of PCVE work. And that opportunity was gone. That opportunity has been missed. So that's what I mean in terms of, there is this sort of wider culture wars that's affecting the ability of PCV to really do what it could actually do. As Daniel Kohler has observed in our handbook, and as he's pointed out elsewhere, one of the things about PCVE work is no matter what experts might understand in terms of the most significant threats, to some degree, policy priorities are always going to be driven by public perceptions. So if you've got a significant part of your sort of political machinery that is directing public perceptions towards particular threats, then that has significant policy pressures. But the other reason why I think PCV is limited in terms of responding to the types of threats that we've been talking about relates to the way that they extend beyond the ambition of PCV work. So there's been a perennial sort of scope issue, if you like, with PCV work, and this is the same in most areas of public policy. So you have pressures towards the expansion of the scope of PCV work. So some of the pressures towards the expansion of that scope have been things like, there's a recognition amongst most experts, whether those academics, practitioners, what have you, that there are complex drivers of political violence, and that because there are complex drivers of political violence, any programs that are intended to prevent that violence needs itself to be complex. It sort of expands out. So that's hence the push for educational interventions, sort of cohesion type work, and so forth. So that sort of expands the scope. There's also scope expansion from what I call scope expansion from below. So a diverse range of actors who see themselves as potentially having a role to play. And also, it's important, I think, to recognise that opportunities to draw down funding. In the UK, and I know in other parts of Northern Europe, PCV agendas arrive more or less at the same time as austerity. Massive decline in budgets for work around things like cohesion, and shifting into PCVE was one of the ways that community-based organisations could actually continue to function. And so a lot of them got involved in that work in part because of sort of economic imperatives and trying to keep some of their work on topics like cohesion going. So all of this sort of was pushed the scope out, if you like, of PCV, but at the same time, there are also counter pressures. And we've seen this in every round of policy review that we have. We sort of see these pressures come into contact with one another. So the counter pressures, so concerns about securitization, the concerns about other policy areas being securitized because of their intersections with PCV work. Concerns about accountability and the need for interventions to be evidence-based. So the further we go away from those kind of tightly defined, individual focused, sort of mentoring type interventions, it can become much harder to actually have a really sort of solid evidence base for those types of work. And the sort of the political pressure to deliver value for money. And again, I don't know how it works here, but in the UK, you know, every time there is an attack, the great fear is this someone who's been in contact with Prevent? And if so, huge pressure straight away on policymakers, you know, about supposed failures. And so I think, you know, because of those kinds of pressures, again, you know, bring the barrier, bring the boundaries in, make it sort of tighter, more managed, you know, manage that kind of risk. One of the upshots of this is that PCV has tended to be very focused around individuals. Again, I think this was one of the points made yesterday. I think also the concern has tended to be with the prevention of specific acts of violence. And there's been less focus on addressing the effects of violence. So that's a really important point. We tend to think preventing and countering. So we tend to think in terms of stopping the violence, not the effects of violence. And I think that's one of the pieces that that's been a bit of a blind spot in the way that we've thought about this. Okay, so moving on to the third point, how PCV can still contribute something. So violent extremism, and again, useful to see the definition used here. So the use or support of unlawful violence, politically motivated communal violence, is a problem. You know, I think we can all accept that violent extremism is a problem. We need to focus on it, and you know, globally, we still see violent extremism exacerbating conflicts and undermining human security. So we need to do something. So what can we do for PCV to still contribute something? So I think there are a number of things we can do. One of these is around articulating more effectively than we probably do at the moment how violent extremism does and does not intersect with other societal challenges. There are some really good examples, I think, that came up yesterday. So some of the stuff around foreign interference, community relations, community tensions, declining trust in public authorities, democratic erosion. There's a panel later today, which I'm really looking forward to. The interactions between these different societal challenges are going to be contextualized. You know, they will change in different national geographies, different local geographies, and the expertise of, you know, people like yourselves will be really important in terms of teasing out what those interactions are. I think part of it is trying to think about what these mechanisms of interaction are. Is this about communications? Is it about how societies produce and manage crises, the destabilization or undermining of systems of governance? But we need to get a better understanding of these interactions. I think an important bit of this is that there shouldn't be a violent extremism centric understanding. So it's not, the question isn't how do all of these things make violent extremism worse. We need to think about how these actually genuinely sort of how they interact with one another. So just to give an example, some colleagues and I at the moment are trying to do some work looking at sort of conflict affected low income countries through sort of an adaptation lens. Our question is basically, how does climate change impacts undermine the ability to adapt to violent extremism threats, and how does violent extremism affect our ability to adapt to climate change impacts? So it's a genuine sort of how they're actually interacting with one another, rather than one problem being sort of given priority over the other. And I think again that's been one of the mistakes that we've made to some degree with violent extremism, is that there has been a tendency to give violent extremism priority over those other challenges. Not always intentionally, but another thing we can do is to identify where PCVE can contribute in terms of these wider challenges, and how it can dovetail with these other areas of practice. I think there's been some great examples of this that have happened sort of globally, and every time I go to these kinds of conferences, I'm always encouraged by some of that experience. I think a lot of that actually happens on the ground, again, sort of partly out of necessity. But I think in terms of PCV, okay, so let's ask ourselves, so where is the evidence base actually strongest? Well, what does PCV do well? You know, so things like, there is some good evidence around things like exit programs, mentoring interventions, some of the educational interventions. You know, there is some good evidence there now. Also, part of this, though, of course, is recognising the limitations and pitfalls of PCVE and planning around that. And part of that is, again, being mindful of the sort of the wider context we're operating in. So in the UK, it doesn't matter whether or not PCV in the UK is or is not sort of now focused on Muslims. What matters is public perceptions, and we need to think about public perceptions when we're planning, when we're thinking about the role of PCV in addressing whatever problems we're trying to address. I think it's also really important when we're doing this to remember that people, movements, groups, like they have free will, and they might respond in different ways. Now, whatever intervention you do, so we have to expect the unexpected to some degree. Like people will respond in ways that perhaps we don't expect, and that's important both in terms of our own expectations, but also in terms of managing public expectations. The other thing I think we need to do is, think about what our delivery plan is. Like how do we really sort of integrate PCV with other areas? So part of that is about it not being siloed. Again, I think this has been something that came up yesterday, and is something that I think people have made a lot of progress in. I think there are some countries that do that quite well. I'd say like Canada is a place that every time I go to Canada, I think actually they've done quite a good job of not having PCV silo, but actually integrating it with other areas. I think the other key thing for me here, though, is thinking about how to do actually a genuine all-of-society approach. So in PCV, we talk a lot about all-of-society approaches, but by that, what we tend to mean is, I suppose, that kind of network of people who work on PCV from academics, policymakers, community-based organisations. Like I mean sort of real all-of-society approach. So even the bits of society that we find difficult or uncomfortable, some of the, when you look at movements that achieve success, they almost always achieve success by sort of creating or managing to hold together unlikely coalitions or alliances. We kind of need to do the same thing. So we need to say, okay, well, who do far-right actors see as their people? We need to work with them. We need to be working with those people. Are there moderates within those sort of far-right and far-right adjacent movements? Like, we need to be engaging with them. We need to be working with them. One of the things that's really clear from work on peace and reconciliation, and so my research centre does work around sort of violence, but it also does a lot of work on peace and reconciliation. But when we look at that work, one of the really clear things is that you have to include everyone, and that includes the people who you sometimes see yourself as fighting against. So that's something that's far more difficult to do. But I think if you look at every time when as conflicts end, I think it is useful sometimes to think of this in terms of conflict. You need to have those kinds of relationships. You need to do things like say, okay, how do you break the cycles of shame and revenge that drive conflict? And I think if we look at what's happening in places, like the US, like bits of Germany, what we are talking about is cycles of shame and revenge. And that's what's fueling this. And unless you break those cycles, you don't can address the problem. So, mindful of time, in conclusion, the current challenges that we're observing, particularly from the far right, go, in my opinion, sort of well beyond what can be dealt with just through PCVE. And in fact, an over-reliance of PCVE to respond to these could actually be challenging. But at the same time, I think PCVE has come a long way. We've learned a lot. And it's important that we make sure that the accumulated experience and insight that we've got doesn't go to waste. Thank you very much.